I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwyn and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. Today, we're going to talk about the folklore of divination. And we're going to get into what the definition of divination is, some historic divination, and then we're going to talk about, as we always do, some stuff that you can do at home. But first, Tanya, how have you been folkloring lately?
Oh, this week in particular, I have been dipping back into some dyeing with plants, which is definitely an ancient practice, right? Until about 100 or so, 150 years ago, the only colors we had on fabrics were from plants. And it's something that I've been doing for, I don't know, 15 years or so. And it comes and goes, my interest in it or my time for it. But we took a little walk on the other side of our creek, which has a lot of trees. And we noticed there was a lot of fallen trees with usnea, fallen branches with usnea lichen on it. And so I had not tried to dye with that before, and I gave it a go. And it was actually one of the easiest ones that I've tried. I don't know why I've never tried it before. And yeah, the color is gorgeous. And then I started looking into a little bit of the folk magic and things around usnea. Like, of course, it's used in herbal medicine quite a bit, but it has quite a bit of folk connotation as well. It's connected to air and protection and health. So I'm crocheting actually, which is also unusual for me. I usually knit, but I'm crocheting myself a little cardigan. What about you, Tracy? What have you been doing for folkloring?
Well, I've only got one this time, but lately I have been trying to befriend the crows that live around my house, putting out seeds and nuts and stuff for them. And they're coming here, but I hear that sometimes they will leave you like little gifts for feeding them.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm just sort of keeping up with it and seeing how it goes. But I definitely had 3 big ones here yesterday eating some walnuts I put out for them.
Nice.
Yeah. So
We try to, we have a lot of crows around here, and we're actually just planted some grass seed yesterday on a part of the pasture that needed it, and I've been sending my dog out to chase the crows away from the grass seed. So we're kind of at the opposite ends of the spectrum there.
you better be careful, man. The crows remember and they hold a grudge.
I know. It's a pretty big pasture, and like just right, usually I leave them be and they're totally fine. But right now we need that grass to sprout before they can eat it.
There you go. Okay. All right. So divination. Just to start on what is divination, the dictionary tells us that it is the art or practice that seeks to foresee or foretell future events or discover hidden knowledge, usually by the interpretation of omens and or by the aid of supernatural powers.
Yeah, and then I looked up the definition of omen, as you do. And an omen is defined as an occurrence of or a phenomenon believed to portend a future event. And then there's this thing that I thought was really interesting. The use of the word omen dipped around 1900. Like, people weren't using that word so much anymore, but it is strongly on the rise again these days, which I thought it was an interesting observation.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the socioeconomic state of that time of the, early 1900s, I think that people were, the Industrial Revolution was coming up, starting up, and they really were looking more at science-based kinds of things. And so I think that there was a social pressure around not believing in more fanciful kinds of things like omens, and that was seen as sort of backwoods and not very educated.
It's interesting that it's mentioned in certain cycle models where you're looking at like what cycles culture goes through that were supposedly coming out of a cycle of science and into a cycle of what this one guy, and I can't pull up his name right now, but he calls it the cycle of inclusion, I think, broader inclusion, I think he is what he calls it. And some people have been calling it the cycle of witchcraft. So we're coming into an era where not everything, like science isn't God anymore. Like there's other ways of knowing or seeing or interacting with the world around us, which I think might be related to that as well. People are more interested in observing what goes around them and interpreting that.
Yeah, I think that you're right. And I think that as science develops and we start to understand some of these things, especially with like quantum mechanics, and as we start to say, hey, maybe there are some ties, as science develops, you start to understand more. And that's where things that are supernatural or mystical, if they start to make sense even a little bit, then people, I think, start to believe a lot more and are more willing to sort of stretch their imagination to things that they hadn't thought possible.
Yeah.
We see that now. I think a lot more people are believing in aliens than used to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if it is like science can explain some things more. So what we thought was magic now looks more like science. And so it's easier to accept, which is probably the case. But I also think that there is a sense within humans of a disillusionment with science and like the modern world in general, and maybe a little bit of a wishing to go back, like, and you see it with the rise of the idea of animism, right? That used to be a very primitive, oh, you talk about it when you're talking about primitive and air quote types and things like that. And animism is like a buzzword these days. Like a lot of people are talking about it.
That's really interesting. And I think that, especially in the United States, as our leadership has been bashing science, maybe not as recently, but there were a lot of people who really became skeptical of medicine in particular
Uh-huh.
with COVID, because that's what our leadership was telling us that then. And so I think that that is part of why people have lost some faith in science.
Yeah. And, you know, clearly science can't explain everything just yet. So,
Right, right. It makes my head explode when someone's like, "Oh, that's just a theory." It's like, scientific theory is not the same as the layman's use of theory, but okay. Okay, so there is a belief that I think that a lot of people currently believe in divination. And so we talked about the definition, but people use it for a lot of different reasons. And I think that they use it to make decisions, they try and find lost objects. Obviously, predict the future is one of the big reasons because we all want to know what's coming for us. And I think also determining causes of illness or even things that you should do about symptoms that you have. And we already talked about omens, so obviously deciphering omens.
there's an interesting one. I think I am not the biggest divination person, but when I do use it, I tend to use it to get to how I really feel about something. So if I have a question and I don't know the answer to it, like should I do A or should I do B? I might do a tarot reading or something. And based on the outcome of that reading, I can make my decision, not because I believe what that reading says, but my personal intuitive reaction to that thing. Like if I'm asking A or B and the cards say B and I'm like, "Nuh-uh, actually, that's not it at all." That's how it often works for me. Yeah, it gives me a structure to actually hang something on, like to make a decision not based on the cards, but oh, this is actually what you should be doing. And then I can have an intuitive hit of like, no, actually, no, that isn't what I should be doing. And I don't know what to call that, but that's how I mostly use it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of divination. I pull oracle cards every day.
Wow.
I use a pendulum, but the way that I think of it, it's very similar to what you're talking about. I think of it as a back door into my subconscious. So when I look at a card and it's, stuck in the mud, and then I start to think about my life through that prism.
Uh-huh.
And I start to think about what it is that I'm doing and my habits. And so it leads me down a path that I would be ignoring or just not paying attention to or what have you. And so that's why I like it, because I feel like if you think too hard directly at a problem, I think sometimes you can trip yourself up.
Yeah.
They say that if you're going to flip a coin, that whatever the thing is that you hope it is, heads or tails, that's the answer you really want. In that moment
Right.
before you know what it is that the answer is, that's the thing you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Britannica tells us that ancient Romans believed that divination was about discovering the will of the gods. So it's helping guide
Mhm.
their behaviors instead of, looking toward the future or looking toward, what are the causes of things. They were trying to figure out what the gods wanted them to do. And there are three different kinds of divination that I found. The first is inductive divination, which employs like a non-human phenomenon. And it can be either artificial or natural that can be read in some way. And so we talk about things like astrology or looking for patterns in lightning, wind,
Mhm.
cloud, those kinds of things, or like what animals are doing, things like that.
Yeah.
The next is interpretive divination. And that is getting back to the omens, reading portents, omens. And the belief there is no event is without a cause. And a couple of types of that would be pyromancy, so looking into the flames, reading the flames, geomancy, and claromancy.
Yep.
And the third is intuitive divination, people who are psychics and who
Ah,
they're just sitting down and saying, what do I feel? And people who read
mhm.
the future and that kind of thing. So let's look at a little bit of the history of divination. And there's
Yeah.
so much history where this is not going to be a deep dive by any means, just because it's endless how much history there is of divination. So the Roman philosopher Cicero wrote a book in 44 BC called Divinatione, concerning divination. And it distinguished between inspirational kinds of divination, such as visions or dreams, and
Uh-huh.
those requiring some form of trained skill, such as astrology. So, oracles, seers, or prophets would be considered inspirational. And I think that gets us back to sort of that intuitive type of divination.
Yep.
So in ancient Greece, they would promote forms of dream incubation for recognition of different ailments. And so we were talking about trying to find causes of different illnesses. And so
Yeah,
in
yeah.
ancient Greece, they would read the dreams.
Sometimes people would go and sleep in the temples, yeah? Is that correct? Or in like cave sanctuaries, they would spend the night there and then those dreams would be interpreted.
Well, I know that in Delphi, they would have the priestesses, they would basically get them high, right? They would have steam
Yeah.
with, different herbs in it. And so those were drug induced kinds of dreams. And they definitely did that at the temple there. And that was, but
Uh-huh.
then of course it was the men that interpreted the dreams. It was the priestesses were just there to get high and babble, I suppose. Okay, couple of different kinds of divination that we saw in the past that we don't see all that much anymore. At least I hope we don't on some of these. Pyromancy is divination using entrails. And that was beginning in Mesopotamia. And then in like ancient Greece, animals were sacrificed and their internal organs, most notably the liver, were inspected for omens.
Uh-huh.
And again, back to Cicero, he wrote, nearly everybody employs entrails in divining. And a healthy liver was considered a positive sign, but if the organ lacked a lobe, doom was certain.
Interesting. I mean, it's yeah, most people nowadays wouldn't slaughter an animal just to foretell the future, But if you are butchering an animal that you're going to eat, like one of the first things anybody ever looks for is how the liver looks. And not so much from a spiritual point of view necessarily, but it's very clear if an animal was healthy if the liver is healthy.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing that that passes over, right? And I do the same. Like if I get an egg with a double yolk, I for sure make that mean something good. Not just that the chickens were healthy and well fed.
Yeah, the Etruscans, they had a life-size bronze model of a sheep liver, and it was marked with names of various gods in different quadrants, sort of like like a
Ah,
phrenology head, but with the liver. And so,
that's awesome.
yeah, so they definitely equated different parts of the liver with different gods. And so I think that they were probably looking for those sections of the liver that were healthy or not healthy to see, which
Right.
gods they had angered and so forth.
Interesting.
Now, we have talked previously, we've talked about tyromancy, which is divination
Yeah.
using cheese. And we talked about, it's the section that molds that would lead people to their future husband. But I did think one thing we didn't touch on last time, or the other, when we talked about it previously, is the Greek diviner Artemidorus did not personally feel that cheese divination was very reliable. And he included cheese diviners among his list of false diviners alongside dice diviners and necromancers. So he definitely felt like the reliable sources of divination were dreams and livers. So not everybody was a big fan of the cheese.
That's funny. Liver is good, but cheese is bad.
Exactly.
That seems like a classist statement right there.
Yeah, there you go. We also talked about divination using melted wax,
Mm-hmm.
although we did touch as well on metal. I think that was our focus
Yep.
on the New Year's episode.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that would be called molybdemancy. Molybdemancy is using molten metal. Now, it doesn't have that particular mineral. It's usually lead, but there you have it.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, moving on to some other kinds of historic divination. In Russia, divination was a popular pastime for the days after New Year, known as the
Mm-hmm.
Strashin. And that's fearful. So, fearful days when evil
Uh-huh.
spirits were said to be active. And
Yep.
they would perform their divination between midnight and 3 a.m. on those days because they thought that was when it was particularly effective.
And nice and quiet, probably.
That's right. So you could concentrate. One popular practice involved under the bowl songs, in which rings and other personal objects were placed in a bowl and special divinatory songs were sung, with each verse corresponding to a particular fortune. So it would be like corresponding to poverty or whether or not you were going to get married, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh. Yep.
In one version of this from the Kaluga province, girls would start by fetching water from a well, speaking the name of the man they wanted to marry as they did so. And once they got home, they poured the water into a bowl and sprinkled in some oats and added rings, a cross, and charcoal, and then covered the bowl and asked someone, and this was usually a widow, to agitate
Mm-hmm.
the water with her pinky finger. And then they would sing a song. So as a group of girls, they would sing a song. And the song that they would sing, they would draw out a ring at the end of each verse while they were singing this song. A popular song was Death is walking down the street. He carries a pancake on a plate. To the one whose ring is taken out, it will happen. It will happen soon. It can't be escaped. So, not sure why someone is carrying their pancake on a plate, but I suppose it's less messy than carrying it in your hand.
I guess. They put their own rings in the bowl, and depending on which ring gets picked out during which verse, like so if the verse is about spinsterhood and my ring gets picked out, it means I won't get married this year.
Right.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes,
Yeah.
that is correct.
Cool.
Yeah. So another one that we don't see a lot of in mid-19th century Belfast, women would predict the character of their future husbands using parts of a herring. And they would use a small silvery colored glutinous membrane of perhaps 1.5 inches in length. It comes from under the backbone of the fish. And they would throw these membranes of a herring that they had eaten against the wall, and then they would interpret the shape that it made when it stuck to the wall.
Very similar to the apple peels, right? Like peeling an apple and throwing it over your shoulder.
Yes. They also practiced this in Scotland, and in the 1824 Gallovidian Encyclopedia, they're a little bit more blunt. So you throw it against the wall, you see the shape of it, and they maybe are looking for physical characteristics of a future spouse and so on.
Wow.
But in the encyclopedia, they said herring somme, the fat of herrings. Young girls throw this against a wall, and if it adheres to it in an upright manner, then the husband they will get will also be so. If crooked, he will be crooked.
Funny.
Yeah. So I guess that was fairly widespread with the herring. And then we get to another famous form of divination that is definitely still around and still popular today, both the I Ching and Feng Shui. So the I Ching involved tossing a series of small pieces of wood that had different markings on them, and they would tell you different things based on how they fell when you threw them. They said that Fu Si, the first emperor of China, was said to have observed a turtle emerging from the Yellow River. And knowing that true wisdom came from direct and close observation of nature, he had a sudden realization when he saw the patterns on the back of the turtle. And he saw that it sort of reflected the energy and movement of life. They say that that's how the I Ching came to be and then, developed over time. Now, when we look at the Christian church, you don't often think about divination, but it is definitely mentioned in Ecclesiastes. They talk about observing the flight of birds for the purpose of divination.
Yeah.
And in Genesis, Joseph practiced hydromancy, and he would pour water into a cup and then throw little pieces of gold or jewels into the cup. And again, observing the figures that were formed by, whatever he's throwing in there. And that's how he was predicting the future. Then at the time of Jesus, the Magi learned by observing the stars that the Christ child was going to be born. And that's how they found out where to go with their gifts.
There's also the one with the prophetic dreams, right? About the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years.
Yes, that's true.
That was prophetic dreams. And there's one that I find compelling, but it's super speculative. In John chapter 8, a woman is caught in adultery and brought to Jesus for him to pass judgment on her. And he responds by writing or drawing something in the dirt. And that has been interpreted as a form of geomancy. Again, super speculative. Of course, after in the end, it says there's the famous quote, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw the stone." I always find that so compelling. A picture of this man sitting in the dirt, maybe doing some divination before he answers.
Yeah, I find that pretty suspect because it was Jesus, right? It was Jesus doing this, right? Couldn't he just ask Dad?
I mean, I think it wasn't, I'm not a Christian, but I don't think he was supposed to be in that easy a contact with God the Father.
Well, yeah, I guess if you do ask God about something, then you have to look for the signs, don't you?
Exactly. And so maybe this was his way of asking God. Again, super speculative, but I find it a compelling image.
Right. Then we get to one of my personal favorites, which is pendulum divination.
Mm.
And the Greeks associated pendulums with the god Apollo. And in ancient Egypt, they made their pendulums from gold and gemstones to better connect with the gods.
Wow.
In ancient Chinese civilization, they used a special pendulum called a cosmic mirror to communicate with the spirit world. So I thought that was kind of interesting. They also, in ancient Egyptians and ancient China, they communed with the gods and gained knowledge about the future as well. And they would try and determine the gender of unborn children with the use of a pendulum.
Interesting.
And I've definitely heard of that in modern times.
For sure.
And in India, pendulum divination is commonly employed in astrology and Ayurveda to gain insight into a person's health and future.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And Native Americans used pendulums in spiritual ceremonies to establish connections with the spirit world and receive messages from their ancestors. And the Romani people have an extensive history of using pendulum divination for fortune telling and predictions. So lots of different examples of that.
I also think in that same sort of category, you can see the water witching, right? Where you walk the land to find water, usually with like there's either willow rods around here. People often do it with just wire coat hangers. So I took a class in that once at a permaculture gathering, and I was not very good at finding water, but the teacher did this fun thing where he would hide chocolates. This was an outside, like in the woods kind of thing. He would hide little chocolates in trees and all around and like have us divine for the chocolates. And that I was really good at. I'm not even that crazy about chocolate, but that worked really well. My husband, who grew up in the mountains, he actually is a phenomenal water witch, and he can find water pipes underground like nobody's business just with his and he just has the wire coat hangers that he uses. And around where I live, when somebody goes and drills a well, almost always they have somebody a water witch come out first to figure out where the water, because here you have to, depending on where you are, you often have to dig pretty deep to get to the groundwater, and that gets very expensive. So people often have like a neighbor who is water witch come out and find the water for them.
That's really cool. Now, a little known fact is that for decades, Chicago had on staff like water diviners, and they were like engineers, and they were specifically what they would do is they would look for breaks in water lines. So when the city was maintaining the sewage systems and the water systems, they had these guys come out, and it was just generally accepted. I don't believe they do it anymore, but it was for many years they used guys to do that. Possibly women. I don't know. I think I'm thinking of like the 50s, 60s, 70s. So I think a lot of those jobs were taken by men.
Honestly, most of the good water witches that I've met have been men. I'd never even considered that, but yeah, I wonder if there's something to that. And it's the same here. It's people are pretty conservative around where I live, but the old folks, it's completely accepted. Like that's totally, water witching is totally what you do.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting that it was so widely accepted that a city like Chicago would pay people to do that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So fun.
So on to bone divination, throwing of bones. And in ancient Africa, in sub-Saharan regions, ancestral bone throwing has been practiced for thousands of years. And the people doing the divination are known as sangomas or babalawos, and they communicate with ancestral spirits and provide guidance to their communities with their bone throwing.
Yeah, okay.
Now, in ancient Europe, the Celts practiced a form of divination known as osteomancy, And they would cast marked bones onto a sacred cloth and interpret the patterns that formed. So they were looking to predict the future, offer spiritual guidance, and it helped them in decision making.
Sure.
And in ancient China, oracle bone inscriptions dating back to the Shang dynasty, which was about 1600 to 1050 BCE. And they would carve questions into animal bones or on turtle shells and then apply heat until cracks formed. And those cracks were interpreted as answers from the divine. Those oracle bones are the oldest evidence of Chinese writing. And they found similar things in East and Northeast Asia and even North America.
Cool.
So the transition from the bones to symbolic systems, they, started out using the bones this way, and then they began to use sticks, pebbles, tokens, and they started making that. And the shift allowed for more standardized meanings.
Sure.
And so that's when you'd see the markings starting to become more standardized. And part of that evolution leads us to tarot. With the introduction of tarot cards to Europe in the 15th century, some people started combining elements of bone divination with tarot reading. And so they'd use them together. And then if you bring us forward to modern day, I think that a lot of practitioners create their own sets. They take pieces that are meaningful to them. They tie colored strings on bones or what have you, and they pull together their own set and they assign meanings to the different pieces. That's how I did mine. I have a set that I like very much that I never use. I made my own definitions of the different pieces that I put in there because they were meaningful to me in specific ways. And so they mean certain things to me that they might not mean to the next person.
Right. And do you only use that for yourself, or would you use that for readings for other people?
I don't really do readings for other people.
Okay.
I just never got into it. I don't know if it's just I don't feel like I'm skilled enough, or I've never done it, never felt comfortable.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. So I think as we have moved to the present, divination doesn't just belong in traditional societies. I think that in some, we were talking about the practitioners in ancient cultures, and I think now people just decide if they're going to do it. There's no cultural sanction, and they jump in. And I think you see a lot of this with paranormal investigators. They proclaim themselves ghost hunters, and they've got their apps. And I always laugh when they do the EVP, the electronic voice phenomenon. So it's really trolling radio stations, radio signals nearby. And sometimes they're like, "Oh, he said Joseph, I heard it clearly." And like, no, that was definitely not. But again, is it just going into sort of the subconscious of the person? And I think a lot of those interpretations have to do with who's interpreting them more than what they actually heard on those. And again, you can get apps on your phone for astrology, for tarot, for runes. Do I have all of those? Yes, I do.
That's funny.
So yeah, it's easy to do it yourself. And if you have an interest in divination, there's so many different ways that you can do it. So I guess we'll talk about some of those.
I think like so many things, you see a pretty big class divide in a lot of different forms of divination. And so we talked about astrology and even tarot. A lot of those things you really need to study up on.
Right.
But we're looking to more folk divination, which is something that was just more accessible to the lower classes as well. So I think that's where we're going right now, right?
Yeah. So many times I've heard that, oh, you need to be gifted your first set of tarot cards. And I don't know if that comes from a time where it was just expensive and hard to get paper.
Yeah.
But I think you also don't necessarily need specifically a $30 set of cards to use. You can use regular playing cards.
Right.
There are lots of different ways that those can be interpreted. And it was the 14th century that playing cards were introduced, and cartomancy appeared soon after because people do
Right.
take what they have and they use those kinds of things to help them with their spiritual practice. It's part of what folkloring is.
And humans are meaning making machines, right? We're trying to see meaning or give meaning to everything around us.
Yeah. And so I think that you can, even we were talking about pendulums and dowsing, people are making it with their hangers, their metal hangers that they bend into the right shape. And you can
Yep.
tie a string to more or less anything and make yourself a pendulum.
Right.
You can go out and get an acorn. It doesn't have to be expensive or fancy. And I think that as we're, like you said, people are meaning making machines, and we take what we have available to us in order to figure out what those meanings are around us.
Right.
And then moving on to, this is a good one. And I think that I like this one a lot because it is not wasteful. And you know how I hate to waste food. Hagiography, which is reading tea leaves. So you drink your tea and you swirl it around in the bottom of the cup and you interpret those shapes. But you can also do tessiography, not just reading tea leaves, but some people read coffee grounds and people even read wine sediment.
Ah, sure.
Yeah. So as you're swirling around the last of that liquid, the meanings that I found is stuff at the bottom of the cup is in the distant future, like more than a month.
Ah,
The middle section is the next week or so, and the top outer rim is for the immediate future. Sometimes when you read the coffee grounds, you take, or even the tea leaves, you take a saucer and you flip it over. And that's
yeah.
kind of how you read it. So I think that
Yeah.
those timings would apply more to that than just swirling it around in your cup and seeing what shapes you see.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah, I've not done it. I have one of those cups. It's a big old teacup and it has different
Uh-huh.
interpretations in different sections. So it's all kind of sectioned out, different
Oh, interesting.
meanings. I don't think I've ever used it, but I think my mother gave it to me because she was like, here, you'll like this weird thing, which fair enough. I do. I have it out. So,
Yeah, that's funny.
and then geomancy.
Mhm.
And this is earth divination. And so it looks at interpreting geographic features, markings on the ground, patterns formed by soil, rocks, sand.
Mhm.
In certain places, like in parts of Africa, they throw handfuls of dirt into the air and observe how the dirt falls.
Yeah.
And in China, the person doing the divination might enter a trance and make markings on the ground that are then interpreted by someone else. And that's often a very young or illiterate boy who does the interpretation.
That's interesting because you see quite often that an interpreter is a young child in other forms of divination as well.
That's very interesting. I wonder if it's because of the innocence that they're not bringing their worldly experiences to the interpretation because they've just had far fewer experiences.
Yep, exactly.
Now, in Korea, geomancy takes the form of interpreting the topography of the land to determine future events and possibly the strength of a dynasty or a particular family. So, not only were the location and the landforms important, but that could shift over time. And so they
Ah,
might, like a family might need to move because a shift in the topography was unlucky.
a landslide.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
yeah. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about feng shui, which involves erecting physical structures by determining the currents of energy running through the earth. And also placing your objects around you based on that same energy as well. So they tell you there are certain directions that you don't want to face your bed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's definitely still practiced to this day.
Yeah, quite popular even in the West.
Absolutely. And there's a similar Hindu system called Vastu Shastra. It's a system of architecture that is based on ancient texts that describe principles of design, layout, measurements, ground preparation, space arrangement, and spatial geometry. So again, sort of using that space. So it's not using the land as much, but it is similar to feng shui in that way of aligning your belongings and your homes in a particular way in relationship to the land around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we talk about runes and the Ogham?
Sure.
Okay, so talking about runes, which is also quite popular again these days, it seems like the sources are pretty unclear of like where it exactly started, but it seems very likely that it started in northern Italy or the Alps originally, potentially dating back to the 1st century AD. It's an alphabet of 24 letters that are used as a method of writing. And these days, it seems also a little bit unclear whether using runes for divination is a more modern practice or that it was also traditional. I personally like runes a lot because they're so open-ended. Like their interpretations can be so broad and really narrow down to your own particular situation. And so also there is a so this is a Germanic alphabet, and then there's a Celtic alphabet called the Ogham alphabet that is an early medieval alphabet to write the early Irish language.
Right.
And then later it became also used as a way to divine. Similarly to runes, where it's written on, so Ogham is usually written on sticks, but it can also be tiles or stones or something similar to runes. One of the things that I really like about the Ogham is apparently the signs are based on how birds look when they fly, which I always thought was beautiful image.
That's very cool. Yeah, I follow a guy on Instagram called, his Instagram is called Crossroad Runes. And every single day he pulls 2 runes and tells you what they are. You know, this is the ox and it represents blah, blah, blah. And then he tells you if you interpret those 2, like where do those 2 cross and what is the pulling of them at the same time? What does that mean? And it's always very interesting. And so I've been learning a lot about the different definition of different runes. I don't really pull them much myself. I've got many sets of them, but only because I include them in one of my games that is based on divination. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to ornithomancy, or divination using birds. And this was a common part of ancient Greek life. And in Aristophanes' comedy, The Birds, the leader of a chorus of birds brags about their usefulness in divination, saying, before undertaking anything, whether a business transaction or a marriage or the purchase of food, you consult the birds by reading the omens. So apparently the birds were proud of themselves for being able to help in the divination. And in ancient Rome, it was practiced by public priests known as augurs, by observing birds and other natural signs to interpret the will of the gods. And they would look at the number of birds, their flight patterns, the songs of both wild birds and caged birds. And they also had caged sacred chickens that could be used. And if food fell from the beak of these sacred chickens while they were eating, that was a really good sign.
That's funny. Yeah, here in Appalachia, we have a lot of bird divination, I guess, like observing the birds and interpreting what that means. So we have When they fly close to the ground, you can expect rain. If a bird sings while it's sitting on the chimney, there will be rain before dark. If a bird flies into the house, it's a sign of death. Birds singing in the morning is a sign of rain. Birds coming close about the house, you can expect bad weather. So it's a lot of it is rain divination. If they fly south earlier than usual in the fall, you can expect bad winter. So this is Croesus, going back to your crow story earlier. It's bad luck if a person sees a single crow in a field. If you see two, it's good luck. 3 means health, and 4 means wealth. 5 crows means someone will be sick, and 6 means death is coming.
Okay, so I had 3 crows out here, so
Yep.
that means health. That's good to know.
Yeah, it's interesting. We usually have like 3 or 4 at a time.
Interesting.
So that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who came up with the if crows sing in the morning, it means rain? Or birds sing in the morning, it means rain? Because birds sing every morning.
Probably someone in Northern Europe where it rains almost every day.
Well, and the other thing is, the time that they don't sing is when it's raining.
Right.
So I don't know. That just seems like a very weird one.
Yep.
Okay, moving on. Electriomancy, which is a subset of divination using birds. And I touched on this earlier, divination using chickens.
Uh-huh.
And so it's not just the food falling from the mouths or the beaks of the sacred chickens. There were various methods that were employed, which uses chickens. One is that they would put food down, and whatever the chicken went to, like whichever grain they went toward, it could represent a location or a direction in which to go. And yeah, or it was an answer to the subject of a question, right? They might ask like a yes or no question and say, how's this battle going to go? Or which one of these people are my future husband? And so whatever the chicken went for first, that was the answer to your question.
Nice.
And so there was an Emperor Valens, who, I guess he was emperor, 364 to 378 BCE. And there was a group of Roman courtiers that were seeking the name of the successor of this emperor's successor. And during the ceremony, a circle was drawn up and they divided it into segments. And the segments all corresponded to a particular letter. And a grain of wheat was placed in each one. And then they did some incantations, and the chicken pecked the grain corresponding to the letters T, H, E, O, and D, which was understood at the time to mean Theodotus, who was a local official and known to be very ambitious. But then the emperor found out about it and had everyone killed that was involved in it, presumably for, looking at his death. And it included Theodotus, so he was not the next emperor. So the chicken was wrong in that case.
Wow, that's crazy though.
Yeah, I imagine it would irritate you if you found out that people were like, well, let's move on to the next emperor.
Yeah. No, I'm seeing it would be crazy to sit there and look at a chicken peck out somebody's actual name. Like that was close enough to that. That was a long name, and that was close enough to that guy's name. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I would definitely take that serious.
Yeah. Now, I wonder if they used all the letters in the alphabet or if they just were kind of stacking the deck and only using particular letters that they knew might correspond to particular people. I think that's definitely possible.
Right.
Okay. Bibliomancy, which is divination using books. And, you see memes about this all the time, right? Like, open the closest book to you and read the 8th line on page 13.
Right.
So I think that that's still very popular. And I think that they used to use the Bible for divination and lots of different things. It's been widespread since books have been around, really.
Right.
And I suppose not widespread because it was hard to get books back in the day, but it was a common practice with people who had books to use their books. And, like using their books for lots of magical things besides divination, or in addition to divination, I think was very common with people that had books, particularly religious tomes, because those were seen to have powerful language in them. And so people used them for magic in general. So it's not surprising to me that they would use them for divination as well.
Yep.
I mean, people use the Bible, the Book of Psalms, and there is a specific kind called the Virgilian lots, and it is a form of divination that interprets the passages from the works of the Roman poet Virgil. Yeah, how specific is that? It's only going to be this guy's poems. So I thought that was kind of funny.
Yep.
And in some places, you don't even need to be reading the books to use them for divination. In Russia, for example, people would tie books to the ceiling using string and then pay attention to which way the books swung when certain names were mentioned. And the direction of the swing could indicate the name of a future spouse or girls who might be getting married soon. So you're using your book as a pendulum.
For real?
Yeah, as we said, you can make anything into a pendulum. So
yep.
if you try hard enough. And then we get to weather divination.
Yeah.
We all know the ever popular Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Not the Bill Murray version where lessons were learned. And then there's Candlemas, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Candlemas and Groundhog Day and Imbolc all around the same time, right? 1st, 2nd of February. So they all have the same interpretation. You're going to get the opposite for the next 6 weeks or until the next sort of festival. You get the opposite of the weather that you're experiencing on the day itself. So if you have a very stormy Candlemas, it's going to be an early spring. If it's a beautiful day on Candlemas, it's going to be a late spring. You're still in for a good bit of winter. And those things were pretty common on most of the cross-quarter days that you're seeing in Celtic countries. And in general, and like days of celebration, like are being observed as weather being forecasted opposite of what it is that day.
Isn't the spring, like Candlemas, isn't there a goddess that if she knows that there's going to be more winter coming up, she makes that day bright and sunny so she can go out and gather supplies to get her through the end of the winter?
Is that the Cailleach?
Yes.
Up in Scotland?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then if it's, stormy, that means she is unconcerned. And so that is why she doesn't need to get more stores.
That's interesting.
Doesn't that translate back to seeing the shadow of the groundhog?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, you see the shadow if it's sunny, and that means, 6 more weeks of winter. But I always laugh because, it's early February and I'm in, northern Illinois. So
yeah.
When is there not going to be 6 more weeks of winter starting in early February?
Right. Yeah, I don't know how it is in Pennsylvania, but here for sure, like, we could have an early spring by the end of February. It's just nice and it's going to stay nice most of the, not summer weather, but no more freezing temperatures or bad storms or anything. Yep.
Now, other ways to determine what the weather is going to be in Scotland, the Highlanders would pound the ground with a stick until a snake would emerge. And then the snake's behavior gave them an idea of how much frost was left in the season. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then in Appalachia, there's a legend that if the cows are laying down in their fields, it means rain is on the way.
Yep, hadn't heard that one.
Yeah. If a rooster crows in the middle of the night, that is foretelling rain the next day. And if dogs begin running in circles, poor weather is coming. I wonder if that has to do with thinking that, animals can sense weather changes.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I know that I had one of my dogs that I had hated thunderstorms, hated loud noises more than anything. And he would start getting upset long before the storm came. Like if it was just like cloudy out, but it wasn't just rain. It was only on thunderstorms. So for whatever reason, he had a sense that it was coming and he was already worried about it.
I wonder if it has to do with their sense of like, ooh, I better go hunting right now because I'm gonna want to not be out in the rain when it comes.
Yeah, definitely could be.
I wonder if that's it.
Could be.
We have one in our area. So I've been here like what 15 years or so. So far, it's always held true. Thunder in the winter, it means that you'll get snow. And some people say within 3 days. I've heard within 7 days and even within 10 days. But it so far, in my observation, if it thunders in the winter, you will get snow. And it might not always be a huge pack of snow or anything, but you'll get.
Interesting. I don't recall there being thunder snow back when I was young. I've definitely heard it like not this winter, but in 2022, 2023 season.
Huh.
There was a couple of different occasions where we had thunder while it was snowing.
Oh.
I don't recall that from when I was young.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was in all the weather forecasts, like there's going to be thunder snow. And I was like, I hadn't even heard that phrase.
Weird. I know, for real. I've never experienced that either. A snowstorm, thunderstorm.
It's very freaky. It really is.
Yeah.
So then also, if birds build their nest closer to the ground than usual, a hard winter is on its way. That's another one. And I think lots of people have heard this. I had certainly heard this before, the saying, red sky at night, sailors delight, red sky in the morning, sailors take warning.
Yeah.
Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about scrying.
Yeah.
The term scrying comes from the Old English term descry, and that means to make out dimly or to reveal. And, we think a lot about scrying in mirrors or looking in a crystal ball. There's lots of different ways that you can do your scrying. You can look into sort of liquid wax. You can scry into the clouds. So not just interpreting the shape, but sort of gazing in and seeing like what you see.
Yeah.
And mirrors, obviously, you just relax your vision and stare into the mirror until images form and interpret those images.
Yeah.
And you can look into water and do the same thing as a mirror and see what images form for you. Or you can look at the ripples, if there are ripples, if you want to create ripples in the water.
Yeah.
And you could do it with oil. The light that reflects off the oil is what you need to sort of stare into and interpret. And the same goes for flames and smoke. It's about the visions, not about interpreting the shapes as much.
Right.
And obviously we talked about crystal ball. You can also, I thought this one was very interesting. You can do it by closely looking at someone else's eye and sort of seeing what visions come up for you while you're doing that.
Yeah, interesting. It gives a focal point, right? I think a somewhat moving focal point for your brain to maybe project images on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, when I'm meditating, I pay attention to the images that come up for me. Again, I think it's interpreting my subconscious.
Sure.
But I know people who can't meditate. They can't sort of calm their brain down in order to just sit there with their eyes closed, maybe listening to music. And so they do more active kinds of meditation. So I can certainly see that someone who isn't able to meditate would be able to use this kind of divination more effectively.
Right.
So then this was an interesting one to me, divination by words overheard. And I guess that now that I'm saying that, it reminds me, we were talking about the ghost hunters earlier. And that really is divination by overhearing words. It just happens to be words that are generally out there on the radio.
Yep.
Okay, so in ancient Greek and Rome, it's called cladonomancy. And it could be practiced either inside or outside in ancient Greek or Rome. And again, back to Cicero. Cicero really gave us a lot about divination. He related a story about a Roman general, Lucius Paulus, who was readying his armies to fight King Perseus of Macedonia. He was coming home one evening, and he noticed that his young daughter, Tertia, looked forlorn. And he said, "What's the matter, Tertia? Why are you sad?" And his daughter replied, "Oh, father, Persa is dead." And Persa was the name of the little girl's puppy.
Wow.
But her father interpreted the words as an omen, meaning he would defeat Perseus. And he did. So good.
Nice.
Yeah, good story there. And we talked about oracles previously, about burning incense or other things. And there is a oracle Hermes at Pharai. And
Mhm.
you would burn the incense and make offerings. And then someone who wanted to know their future would whisper a question into the ear of Hermes' statue and then cover their ears and walk away. And then the first words that they heard when they uncovered their ears were interpreted as the answer to their question.
I love that one. How so great.
Yeah.
I'm going to try that one.
Yeah, and that's one that you don't need much of anything to do.
No, like an offering and a prayer. That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And so I suppose then you would have been at an oracle. So you would have gone out into public and it would have been more random people. So
Right.
maybe try it at home when nobody is home and then go out to get.
Yeah.
Anyway, that does kind of lead us to folkloring that you can do easily at home or wherever you are.
Yeah.
So maybe we should talk about a few of those things.
Sounds great. But I'm going to do this Hermes one. I think it's awesome. That'll be the first one.
Cool.
Of the suggestions, I guess we have.
Yes. Now, we talked about casting bones earlier, and you can make your own set of bones. I have my set, as I said earlier, and the bones that I used in my set, I make my own bone broth. So I saved some of the bones that were still harder, that weren't crumbly at the end of, boiling them. I usually do my chicken for 24 hours and my beef and lamb for 48 hours. So a lot of the bones are pretty weak at the end. But for those that aren't, I took some of those and I tied different colors of yarn around them. So that's how I got those for something I would have thrown away.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And they're super clean after boiling for that long. So it was, instead of having to figure out how to clean them, it all just came together.
And that's one of those things that if you're into that, the aesthetic of that is pretty on point, I would say.
Yes. And then I used different charms and different things that were meaningful to me and some coins that have a more universal meaning. So I think that what you do there is you gather up pieces that appeal to you, small things that appeal to you. I use mine on a big piece of leather, like a leather mat. So they don't tend to move around like much more than when I actually toss them. And then I made up all of my own meanings for each of those pieces. So it was a fun project to do. It was a fun little crafty project. And they are meanings that are specific to my lived experience. So I think that that can be fun if you're into that kind of thing.
Do you have like quadrants laid out on your throwing cloth or no?
No, I really look at how the individual pieces are arranged with each other.
Yeah, in relation to them. Yeah. Kind of like a tableau reading in Lenormand Harrow. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
And we talked earlier about opening a book and reading a line or a passage, and that's obviously available to people who have books.
Yeah.
But, you could do it in a magazine, or you could do it with whatever you have. You can do it off the back of a cereal box if you really want.
I think they have them online even.
Yeah. Yep. And reading your tea leaves or coffee grounds. We talked about that earlier. So if you use loose tea, you can do that. And if you are making coffee, you can toss some of your coffee grounds in and use them that way.
Yeah.
You can also just pay attention to the symbolism around you. When you go for a walk, look for shapes in the clouds or shapes on the ground where there's dirt or there's sticks laying, or what the shapes of the plants around you are. And that's an easy way. And again, with folkloring, it does always come back to that of being mindful of what you're doing and what's around you.
Exactly. Yeah, and have a quiet and inquisitive mind and just paying attention to what happens around. Like I've seen a lot of times where, sticks will fall on the ground or show up somewhere in the sign of runes or things like that.
Yeah. And you can get yourself an app on your phone for a spirit box if you are into listening for whatever you can interpret out of those little bits and pieces of words that come through.
Interesting.
You can do scrying. We talked about a lot of different things that you can scry with.
Yeah.
Honestly, it seems like you can scry with anything shiny.
Just about.
And then there's also some people do automatic writing, which we have not talked about automatic writing yet. And they just sit down and kind of start to write without thinking about it and just see what comes through for them. People use that as a form of either speaking to spirits or predicting the future. That's an easy one to do at home as well.
Yeah, I feel like that was super popular in like the 70s and 80s, and it's kind of fallen by the wayside. But whole books were written in automatic writing.
Yeah, that one to me is, again, another clear example of tapping into your own subconscious.
Uh-huh.
But I don't want to be too much of a skeptic. Maybe they are talking to spirits. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Okay, any other at-home folkloring that people can do around divination?
No, I think for me personally, the biggest one is like being open to things being meaningful. Like what I said earlier, something along the lines of if I crack an egg into a pan and it has a double yolk, I make that mean good things. And I think for me, just walking around like that, as if the world is talking to me, I think the world is talking to me and like trying to be open to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that you hear people talk a lot about intention. It's all about intention. But I think that specifically going about your life as I'm going to interpret these eggs in a good way, or you're really looking for that energy of how to look at the better side of life. And I think that no matter if your interpretation is correct or not, you're having a happier life because you're looking for the good in the world around you.
I mean, unless you're consistently seeing bad omens, of course, but yes.
That's true. And that might be something to watch for if you are consistently seeing bad omens,
Right.
because then you're drawing that energy towards you as well.
Right.
And you're focusing on that side of life. And I think when you do focus on the negative, not only do you see more of it, but you interpret negative things. Like things happen. And when some things impact you negatively, but a lot of things just happen and it's not good or bad, but you can interpret it that way.
Sure.
There's that old joke about the farmer who he got a horse and his neighbor came by and said, "Oh, you're so lucky you got this horse." And he's like, "Maybe."
Uh-huh.
And then the horse like threw a shoe. And he said, "Oh, you're so unlucky." The horse threw, and it kept going on. And he just refused to interpret these individual occurrences as good or bad.
Right.
He just said, I'm going to see where that goes.
Right.
And I think nothing is personal, right? People do stuff, things happen, and it's not necessarily personal. And so not interpreting it that way. And believe me, I am definitely guilty about this. Like, oh, so-and-so didn't text me. They're mad at me, right?
Uh-huh.
But not looking at the world that way, I think brings a lot more joy to your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Anything else before we wrap up?
No, I think that's it for me.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here. And we appreciate you listening to us. If you liked what you heard, please give us a follow and some feedback. We love your feedback. And we hope that we will catch you next time. As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.